Recently, I've been on a bit of a Star Wars run, playing through the different games, watching different Star Wars TV shows and movies, and I just recently finished the newly released Jedi Survivor, which was an absolutely fantastic game that I also want to make an analysis of. So in order to fill that Star Wars game itch even more, I decided to visit Force Unleashed 2, a game that I'd never actually played, although playing the first Force Unleashed recently in 2022, and having played it before as a kid as well. I really did enjoy Force Unleashed 1, and I was really excited to see what Force Unleashed 2 held. Instead, the game ended up being entirely disappointing in pretty much every facet, especially when compared to the original game, and the game is frankly quite horrible. Honestly, this video is going to be quite short because there's not actually much here to analyze, and like the game itself, this video is going to be short. And first, let's talk about the gameplay of the game. The gameplay here was quite disappointing in all aspects. Of course, Force Unleashed 1 didn't have the greatest gameplay. It definitely did match up to something like Jedi Survivor, but I always have to look at games in the lens of when they released, and so I don't compare it to Jedi Survivor or other games that I've played out there. And I was trying to look at Force Unleashed as a completely separate game in its own right, being released over 10 years ago now, so it's pretty old and outdated. The first Force Unleashed actually felt less outdated than this one, which is quite bizarre. The gameplay in Force Unleashed 1 wasn't great as well, but it was actually quite fun, and there was a few different mix-ups by you getting different powers such as Force Lightning and evolving your Force Push, for example, really made that gameplay eventually spice up as you kept playing through the game, unlocking new and new abilities in order to spice up the gameplay and the combat. But here in Force Unleashed 2, the fact that you've already gained all those powers in the first game, the second game doesn't really add anything to Starkiller's arsenal, and I think that's because he's already quite overpowered. There's not much you can give him, and the game itself is already quite easy, and even on higher difficulties, I find myself having no challenge with the combat encounters in the game, and that's a huge problem where the boss encounters and the normal enemy encounters aren't quite diversified and feels like the same thing over and over again, just abusing the same powers over and over again because you already have all these powers. There's not much more you can do to upgrade your arsenal. You're already quite overpowered from the first game's abilities. And another thing I caught out about the gameplay of this game is that the mission variety just wasn't there. In the first 45 minutes of the game, you're on the same damn planet doing the same thing over and over again, and there's no variety within the different structures that you're going through, the architecture you're going through. Everything feels the same and mundane, that they just copy pasted all these textures. The first game had a few more planets to explore, different environments to see, and that really diversified the gameplay and the mission variety, but there just isn't here in any capacity. And the fact that the powers do not really change from the first game, that your powers are not expanded upon, and all combat encounters can essentially be handled in the same way, doesn't really help the gameplay in any facet, because I see myself abusing the same powers over and over again because it's the most efficient way to go through an enemy encounter, and doing any other way would just be boring or just be tedious to do because there isn't much complex mechanics for you to delve into in order to bring out that awesome gameplay here. And I think what worsens this even more is the fact that there is a huge lack of enemy variety in this game, and every enemy feels so weak and so mundane. With all the different abilities you have, you can just tackle each enemy with the same way. Either it be a huge robot monster, mechanical monster, or a stormtrooper, I'm going to be spamming the B button or using Force Lightning or just spamming the same lightsaber throw attacks again and again because that's the most efficient way to attack those enemies, and doing anything else isn't fun because it's tedious, especially with the fact that the enemies all kind of act in the same way. There's not too much variety in the scripted encounters with the enemies, such as being able to take off their shields and the quick time events, makes the gameplay here not as fun as it could be. And with all that being said, I've got to say that the gameplay overall and the combat actually just got stale after an hour, and after an hour I just found myself using the same abilities over and over again, hoping that there would be more variety added to the combat, especially when you got a new ability, but those new abilities were just him remembering abilities that he had in the first game, and this whole thing of not having the abilities and then getting them and then them doing the exact same thing and not being able to have proper upgrades like a skill tree in order to unlock new abilities that would do completely different things to what you can already do is a really big letdown for the game. And the fact that all the abilities do, all the skill points do, is just upgrade how powerful you are, doesn't really add to the game's diversity and really takes this game's combat out of the loop. And I really do think that the gameplay here just gets quite stale after a very short period of time. I also just want to quickly touch upon the base of the story of the game here, and there's not much to discuss because the game doesn't really have a story. One of the most disappointing things about this game is the fact that it's only 3 hours. I don't know how long the first game is by memory, but it definitely didn't feel like 3 hours, and I felt like I actually had a lot more time with the game, and seeing all the different planets and stuff in that first game definitely makes me feel that that game was much longer than this game, at least double the time, or maybe just the diversity of the first game really made it feel longer than it actually was, especially with the fact the second game doesn't have too much diverse areas in order for you to explore and see and fight in, essentially, which makes the game quite stale in all aspects. The story from the first game wasn't anything amazing, and it also feels quite fan servicey like this game, but it of felt it to a lesser degree, and the first game's story was actually quite decent, and I was quite interested to see how they could maybe develop Juno and Starkiller's relationship. But the fact that Starkiller, whatever, it gets cloned at the start of this game was a really weird twist and quite random from what the game's developers could do, and the fact that they just cloned him but didn't make it a major part of the story or something that actually contributed to his character in any significant way was quite disappointing, because he is a clone but he has the exact same emotions towards, for example, Juno and the other people out there like General Coda, so he's not really feeling like a different character or a clone of himself. He just feels the exact same. Maybe that's what they were going for, but that's quite lazy, and there was no point of even having this whole clone sub-context if he was just going to be the same character again without any other different emotional strings or whatever. The story here also just feels quite random, and it feels like a fan service writing. It feels like a random fan was chosen to write the game's story, and they wrote the story because the story here just feels so fan servicey, and with the amount of OP powers that Starkiller has, nothing could really hurt him, and it doesn't make anything in the game feel scary that something can actually harm Starkiller. Instead, every encounter with every enemy in the game, including Darth Vader at the end of the entire game, Darth Vader, who's supposed to be super powerful and be the most powerful Sith Lord in the entire galaxy, even he doesn't feel like a threat compared to Starkiller because of how OP Starkiller is. And that makes each encounter in the game feel less intimidating and makes the whole gameplay and story experience not that great, to be honest. And the fact that the whole story just feels quite generic and lazy from the writer's perspective makes this whole game even more let down, even though the gameplay itself is already not that great. So having a good story could have saved the game, but the story here just uses a generic plot point of Boba Fett trying to capture Juno in order to lure Starkiller. It's not a very original story, and it doesn't feel like the developers here really thought of something creative in order to bring the emotions of Starkiller out and bring a story that was actually fascinating and expanded amazingly upon the original game. Overall, I'm super disappointed with this game, and I was really expecting something a bit better than the first game, as there was definitely things for the developers to work with and work on in order to make the second game way better than the first and make it an absolute fantastic Star Wars game. Instead, we've got a disappointing system of combat and gameplay and also mission variety that doesn't make the game fun in any way and makes it get stale after just an hour, even though the game is only 3 hours long. So there was a lot of things that the game could have done in order to do quality control within that time, but the whole game just feels stale about after an hour. And the story here is also quite bad and horrible. And I can see why this game was quite frowned upon when it first came out, and I don't recommend that you play this game for any reason. Even if you want to play through that gameplay experience, I recommend Jedi Fallen Order, for example, goes on sale for $5 almost every other week. And so if you want to play a good Star Wars experience, I recommend that instead of playing something like Force Unleashed 2. Anyway, that's all from me for today's video. I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.